For centuries, this bird has been the world's favorite symbol of stupidity. As dead as a dodo, as dumb as a dodo. We drew it fat, clumsy, and too stupid to survive. But here's the strange part. Scientists never actually had a complete skeleton to study for over 300 years. They were building the world's most famous extinction story from scraps, sailors' rumors, and a handful of old paintings. And when researchers finally started digging deeper, what they found didn't just correct a few details. It completely shattered everything we thought we knew about this bird. So what did the dodo actually look like? Why did it really disappear? And why did it take modern science more than 3 centuries to solve this mystery? Stick around, because the true story of the dodo is stranger, sadder, and far more fascinating than the cartoon we grew up with. Let's rewind to the year 1598. Dutch sailors, blown off course by a storm, land on a small tropical island in the Indian Ocean. This island had no name that mattered to the outside world yet. It would soon be called Mauritius. And on this island, the sailors encountered a bird unlike anything they had ever seen. It stood about 3 feet tall. It had a large hooked beak, small useless wings, and it did not run away when humans approached. Why would it? For millions of years, this bird had no natural predators, no wolves, no big cats, nothing that hunted it from the ground. It had never learned to fear anything that walked on 2 legs or 4. So when the sailors came ashore, hungry after months at sea, the birds simply stood there, curious, unbothered, trusting. That trust would become a death sentence. The sailors called it Wild Vogel, which roughly translates to disgusting bird, reportedly because the meat didn't taste very good. But disgusting or not, the bird was easy to catch. You didn't need traps. You didn't need weapons. You just needed to walk up and grab it. And that is exactly what happened, again and again, for the better part of a century. Here's where the mystery really begins. The dodo was only ever seen alive by European eyes for less than 80 years. Discovered around 1598, and by the 1680s, most historians agree it was already gone. Extinct. Wiped from the earth in less time than a single human lifetime. Think about that. An animal that had existed for millions of years, evolving in isolation on one island, vanished in less time than it takes to build a modern city. And here's the truly strange part. Almost no one at the time thought to properly document it. There was no photography, no video, just a handful of sketches made by artists who, in many cases, had never actually seen a living dodo. Some of the most famous paintings were based on stuffed, poorly preserved specimens sent back to Europe. Birds that had been stuffed with straw by taxidermists who had no idea what a dodo was even supposed to look like. This is why for over 300 years, our entire understanding of the dodo came from questionable art and secondhand descriptions. Fat, waddling, comically clumsy. That image became the accepted truth. It got repeated in textbooks. It got repeated in cartoons. It even got baked into our language. But almost none of it was based on real scientific evidence. It was based on guesswork, bad taxidermy, and artistic exaggeration passed down for centuries like a game of telephone that nobody ever fact-checked. So if the popular image was wrong, what was the truth? This is where the real mystery and the real detective work begins. For over 300 years after the dodo's extinction, scientists had almost no physical evidence to work with. There was no complete skeleton anywhere in the world. Most of the specimens brought back to Europe rotted, were thrown away, or were destroyed in fires. In fact, one of the most devastating losses happened in 1755 when a fire at the Oxford Museum destroyed nearly all that remained of a stuffed dodo specimen, leaving behind only a head and a foot. That head and foot became, for centuries, some of the only physical dodo material left on the entire planet. Imagine trying to understand an entire extinct species using little more than a head, a foot, and some old paintings of unknown accuracy. That is genuinely the position scientists were in for generations. And because of that gap, myths filled the space where real knowledge should have been. The dodo was too fat to fly. The dodo was slow and stupid. The dodo practically walked into extinction because it simply didn't have the brains to survive. These ideas felt true because they were repeated so often, but repetition is not evidence. The real turning point came much later, in the swamps of Mauritius. In 1865, a school teacher and naturalist named George Clark heard rumors about a marshy area on the island called the Mer aux Singes. Locals believed old bones might be buried in the mud there. Clark organized a dig, and what they found changed everything. Buried in that swamp were hundreds of dodo bones, the remains of birds that had likely gotten stuck in the mud while trying to drink from a nearby water source centuries earlier. For the first time, scientists had real skeletal material to study instead of guesswork and rumor. But even this discovery didn't fully solve the mystery. The bones were mixed together, jumbled, and it was incredibly difficult to reconstruct exactly how they fit into a single accurate skeleton. Museums around the world began assembling dodo skeletons using these bones, but here's the unsettling truth. Many of those skeletons were built using bones from multiple different individual birds, sometimes even guessing at proportions, because a single complete skeleton from one bird simply didn't exist. For over a century, the museum displays that told the world what a dodo looked like were, in a very real sense, educated guesses stitched together. That changed dramatically in 2005 and 2006 when a team of scientists returned to the Mer aux Singes swamp with modern excavation techniques. This dig was different. It was scientific, methodical, careful, and it produced something remarkable, the most complete and best preserved single dodo skeleton ever found, later nicknamed the Fred skeleton in some circles. For the first time in human history, researchers could study the bones of one individual bird in the right proportions without guesswork stitching different animals together. And this is where the story gets genuinely exciting, because what scientists learned from careful modern analysis completely rewrote the dodo's image. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive into forgotten history and solved scientific mysteries is the kind of thing you enjoy, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. I release videos like this regularly, uncovering the real stories behind the myths we all grew up believing, and you will not want to miss what's coming next. Also, drop a comment below and tell me, had you ever heard the real story of the dodo before this video? Or did you also grow up thinking it was just a fat, dumb bird? I read every comment, so let me know. All right, back to the mystery. So what did modern science actually discover once real bones, real anatomy, and real forensic analysis entered the picture? First, the fat and clumsy image was largely wrong. Researchers studying the leg bones and overall skeletal structure determined the dodo was likely a lean, athletic bird, at least for parts of the year. It was well adapted to moving through the forests of Mauritius. Those old paintings showing an obese, waddling bird were almost certainly based on overfed captive specimens kept in European menageries. Birds that were stuffed with food by their keepers and had nothing to do all day but eat, or on stuffed taxidermy mounts that had been overstuffed by people who had never seen the animal alive. In its natural habitat, the dodo appears to have been considerably more streamlined and functional than the cartoon version we know. Second, scientists discovered evidence that the dodo's body may have changed with the seasons. Mauritius has a wet season and a dry season, and food availability shifted dramatically between them. Some researchers believe the dodo may have gorged during times of plenty, building up fat reserves, and then leaned out during leaner months, similar to strategies seen in some modern birds. This means the fat dodo image might have been accurate for certain individuals at certain times of year, but was wrongly applied as the permanent default appearance of the entire species. Third, and this might be the most important discovery of all, the dodo was not stupid. This idea that the bird was simply too dumb to survive was never based on brain size studies or behavioral science. It was based on the fact that the bird wasn't afraid of humans, but not being afraid of a predator you have never encountered before is not stupidity. It's simply the result of evolving on an isolated island with no natural threats for millions of years. When CT scans were eventually performed on dodo skulls, researchers found a brain size proportional to other pigeons and doves of similar body size, which actually places it in a fairly normal to reasonably intelligent range for a bird. The dodo wasn't unintelligent. It was unprepared because nothing in its evolutionary history had ever prepared it for a predator that walked upright and carried weapons. This leads to one of the biggest breakthroughs solved by genetic science. For a long time, scientists debated what the dodo actually was, taxonomically speaking. What was its closest living relative? Some early naturalists doubted it was even a bird species that made sense within known evolutionary trees. It seemed too strange, too specialized, almost like evolutionary science had made an exception for this one bizarre creature. It took DNA analysis extracted from preserved bone material to finally settle the debate. Researchers confirm the dodo's closest living relative is the Nicobar pigeon, a strikingly beautiful bird found in parts of Southeast Asia. In fact, the dodo is now classified within the pigeon and dove family entirely. That's right, one of history's most infamous extinct animals was essentially an enormous flightless pigeon that evolved in isolation for millions of years until it became something almost unrecognizable from its ancestors. Think about how strange that is. A small flying pigeon's ancestors arrived on an isolated island, found abundant food and zero predators, and over countless generations evolved into a completely different creature. No need to fly meant flight muscles shrank. No predators meant no need for speed or fear. Evolution, given enough time and the right pressures, transformed a modest flying bird into the 3-foot-tall ground-dwelling giant that later shocked Dutch sailors. So if the dodo wasn't fat, wasn't stupid, and was a fairly ordinary bird by evolutionary standards before humans arrived, what actually killed it? This part of the mystery has also been re-examined by modern researchers, and the real answer is more layered than the simple story of hungry sailors eating them into extinction. Yes, hunting by sailors happened, and it certainly didn't help. But research increasingly points to a combination of factors working together. When European ships arrived on Mauritius, they didn't come alone. They brought rats, pigs, monkeys, and dogs, either intentionally or as stowaways. These introduced animals were devastating for the dodo, not primarily because they hunted adult birds, but because they raided nests. Dodos, having evolved without ground predators, built simple ground nests, laid what was likely a single egg, and had no real defense against animals digging up and eating those eggs. A species doesn't need every adult killed to go extinct. It simply needs its reproduction to fail generation after generation until there aren't enough birds left to sustain the population. Combine that with habitat destruction as the island was cleared and developed. Combine that with limited hunting for food and novelty by sailors, and you get a perfect storm. Not one single cause, but multiple pressures hitting an animal that had absolutely no evolutionary defense against any of them. The dodo didn't die out because it was foolish. It died out because it was suddenly and violently thrust into an ecological situation it had zero preparation for over the course of just a few decades. And that, honestly, might be the most important lesson buried inside this entire mystery. The dodo has become a punchline, a symbol of failure. But the real story is a sobering case study in how quickly human expansion can erase something that took millions of years to create. Once the dodo was gone, it was gone completely. No photographs, no video, no DNA sample taken while it was still alive. Just fragments, myths, and centuries of scientific detective work trying to piece together the truth from whatever scraps remained. Modern technology has continued to add new layers to this mystery, even in recent years. Advanced 3D scanning of skeletal remains has allowed researchers to build detailed digital models of dodo anatomy without risking damage to the incredibly rare physical bones. Some research teams have used these models to study exactly how the bird would have walked, balanced, and moved, giving us the most accurate picture yet of a living, breathing dodo in motion. There has even been renewed scientific interest in dodo genetics as part of broader conversations happening in modern biotechnology, where some research groups have discussed the theoretical possibility of using preserved genetic material and the dodo's close living relatives, like the Nicobar pigeon, to explore what de-extinction science might one day be capable of. Whether or not something like that ever becomes a genuine reality is still a serious and heavily debated question among scientists, but the fact that this conversation is even happening shows just how far our understanding of this bird has come since those confused Dutch sailors first stumbled onto its island home. So let's return to the question we started with. What was the dodo's biggest mystery, and has it truly been solved? The honest answer is mostly yes, but it took over 300 years, a swamp full of scattered bones, a devastating museum fire, a modern scientific excavation, CT scans, and DNA sequencing to get there. We now know the dodo was likely leaner and more athletic than popular imagination allowed, that its brain size was unremarkable for a bird its size rather than proof of stupidity, that it was genetically a giant flightless pigeon, and that its extinction was caused by a combination of introduced predators, habitat loss, and hunting, rather than any single simple explanation. The image most of us grew up with, the fat, dumb, waddling cartoon bird, turns out to be one of the biggest cases of scientific mistaken identity in natural history, corrected only through patient, painstaking modern research. The dodo story is a reminder that history and science are not fixed. What we believe to be true can be built on shaky evidence. Repeated so often it starts to feel like fact, until someone finally digs deeper, literally in this case, and uncovers the truth buried underneath centuries of assumption. It's also a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be when it evolves without preparation for the dangers the outside world can bring, and how quickly something irreplaceable can disappear once those dangers arrive. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with me through this deep dive into one of history's most misunderstood animals. If you learned something new today, or if this completely changed the way you picture the dodo in your head, do me one favor before you go. Hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and helps more people discover the real story instead of the cartoon myth. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are so many more solved mysteries, forgotten history, and strange true stories coming your way very soon, and you do not want to miss them. Drop a comment down below with your thoughts on the dodo's true story, and let me know what mystery you want solved next. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.